Okay, well, I'm Lois Potter, and I've done the introduction to the third edition of King Lear for the CUP. Well, these days, of course, people talk about trigger warnings, and one could say that you might warn the students that some really terrible things are going to happen in this play. But apart from that, I think the most important thing is actually to know that Shakespeare was basing this on a well-known story. He did not make up, for example, the first scene. In the first scene, a king asks his daughters how much they love him, and the first two say, oh, they love him more than anything in the world, and the third one says, I love you exactly as much as I ought to love you, and he's furious. And a lot of people read this and say, why on earth doesn't this girl just tell her father what he wants to hear? The answer, obviously, is if she'd done that, there would be no play. But it's not only that, it's that that is the story. There's a story that you find in quite a few cultures. I suppose the other context that's interesting is the historical one. It was written quite early in the reign of King James, James I of England, but James VI of Scotland. When he came to the throne, he united the crowns of England and Scotland, but the two countries were not formally united until 1707. James wanted them to be united much earlier. So the play, which begins with the king dividing his kingdom, is also about the situation of a king who united the kingdom, many years later. And there is a sense in which the unhappy ending is still sort of looking forward to the happy ending, which is going to be 1,000 years later or more, really, under King James. Well, the Folio was published in 1623, and it was a very big, expensive book. It was a collection of Shakespeare's comedies, histories, and tragedies, and it was published as the tragedy of King Lear. The quarto was a single play text, really like a paperback, and it was published in 1608, and it was called The History of King Lear. So the two may have been thought of in different ways. They are actually quite different. Sometimes the words are different. Quite often they're different in a way that suggests that somebody might have been misreading something. In one place someone says, "Oh, Father," in one text, and it's "Oh, fault" in the other, for example. On the other hand, there are also very big differences, like there are two scenes that don't appear in the Folio, which are in the quarto. So there's a lot of argument about why this is, whether somebody revised the Folio and cut these scenes and changed various words, and whether, if so, that somebody was Shakespeare or somebody else. Earlier discussions of King Lear were mostly about the fact that it was a tragedy and why it was a tragedy. And there was a view that tragedy was, as Aristotle said, a case of somebody, basically good person, making a terrible mistake, which then leads to all sorts of awful things happening. Now, most readings of the play are more political, either Marxist or feminist. They don't necessarily think that the king was a basically good person. They think that what he was doing was wrong and not just a mistake. And this affects their attitude to the other characters. The daughters, the two older daughters, are seen as to some extent victims. Why do they behave like this? What has their father done to them in the past that makes them like that? And in the other plot in the play, the father with two sons, one good, one bad, well, he's treated the bad son badly, so in a sense he deserves what he gets. And that's one attitude. It partly comes from a dislike of patriarchy, the notion that either a father or a king deserves love and respect just because of who they are. The other thing is feminism, of course, and feminism means that one is angry at the way the daughters are depicted, because to some extent the play does suggest that the daughters are even worse than the wicked son just because they're women, and women shouldn't be like that. And obviously women reading the play now get annoyed with that, and even annoyed with the third daughter, the good one who tells the truth, because they feel that she shouldn't be the good one, she should be rebellious too. Oh, there have been so many. I think the critical history of the play has very much affected the way productions are done now. It used to be that you got a totally sympathetic King Lear and two really wicked daughters and one virtuous daughter, and now there's much more a tendency to depict him as really harsh, tyrannical. Even in some productions, there's a suggestion that he might have sexually abused the two older daughters. On top of that, of course, there are interesting new traditions in casting, colorblind casting or color-conscious casting, genderblind casting, and a lot of this has been very interesting. There have been very good productions of Lear set in a completely different context, like an African kingdom, the Don Warrington King Lear at Manchester, which seemed to me to be very impressive, though I've only seen it on video. And I'm old enough to have seen the Peter Brook version, which was done in 1962, and which affected really all subsequent productions. It was the one that did try to make a case for the older daughters, that depicted King Lear as something of a tyrant, and that took a very harsh view generally of the play, and a lot of productions have been quite harsh, I think. But I've also liked productions that were a bit softer. I mean, a good example of a gender-blind one would be the very recent one with Glenda Jackson playing King Lear, which I found very moving. And I realized, in fact, watching it, that one of the things that most affects the way I feel about the end of the play is whether I believe that Lear really does love Cordelia, the youngest daughter, and I did feel that very much in this production. I liked the one at the Globe a couple of years ago very much. That was done very simply. The idea was that it began with what were like a group of homeless people breaking into a theater that was all kind of boarded up and not for them. And then they put the play on. It was somewhat shortened, but I thought it was still very effective. Well, one reason obviously was the political situation in the Anglophone world. People felt that the line, which I've often heard get murmurs of agreement, "'Tis the time's plague when madmen lead the blind," is extremely appropriate. There's also another key word, which is Alzheimer's, and I think for a lot of people, the situation of King Lear as the play goes on, when he's driven mad partly by the way his daughters treat him and partly by the storm, becomes very moving. And a lot of people have recognized it as something like what older people feel like. You know, the population is living longer and longer. So that I've also noticed in productions that when Lear says to his daughter, sort of mockingly, "Dear daughter, I confess that I am old. Age is unnecessary." This really gets the audience. Another reason probably why it gets put on so much is that there are lots of very good actors who are the right age to play Lear. Of course, it's hard to say what the right age is. Lear is supposed to be at least 80. He says he's 80 and upwards. And Glenda Jackson was 80 when she played it, amazingly, learning all those lines at that age. Everybody was astonished. But people have played it, of course, much younger. And in fact, Richard Burbage probably was in his 40s when he played it, and David Garrick, I think, was about 25 when he first played it in the 18th century.